You're not watching this by accident. If you are part of the American middle class, this video is about you, your savings, your retirement, your purchasing power, and your future. There are 127 million American adults who fall into a category economists quietly call financially exposed. They have some savings, some assets, and some income, but not enough protection. And throughout history, this group is always the one that loses everything. Not the poor, because they have little to lose. Not the wealthy, because they have leverage, mobility, and protection. The middle class always absorbs the damage. This is not speculation, fear, or prediction. It is a historical pattern that has repeated for over 2,000 years. But once that pattern reaches its final stage, no policy, election, or technology has ever stopped it. That number matters because those 127 million Americans depend on three things to remain stable: a functioning currency, reliable wages, and asset prices that do not permanently outrun income. When one of these breaks, stress begins. When two break, instability spreads. When all three break, wealth is erased quietly, legally, and permanently. This always happens slowly at first, and then all at once. Most people misunderstand collapse. They imagine riots, banks shutting overnight, or ATMs going dark. That is not how modern collapse works. Modern collapse happens through purchasing power erosion, taxes that never go down, asset inflation that locks people out, and wages that never catch up. People keep working, paying bills, and trusting numbers on screens, until one day, the math no longer works. This video is not about panic, it is about arithmetic. Money is not emotional. Debt is not emotional. History is not emotional. History repeats one thing: systems that expand beyond productive capacity always correct by destroying the middle class. The pattern follows the same stages every time. Stage 1 is stability, where currency works, wages buy necessities, debt is manageable, and people trust the system. This is when the middle class grows. Stage 2 is expansion, where debt grows faster than income. Governments borrow to maintain living standards, central banks smooth cycles, and asset prices rise faster than wages. It feels good at first, credit becomes normal, and people feel wealthier. Stage 3 is distortion, where growth no longer comes from productivity but from leverage. More debt, more currency, more promises. Wages stagnate, costs rise, savings lose purchasing power, and the middle class begins to shrink. Stage 4 is resolution, where debt cannot be paid back in real terms and is instead resolved through inflation, debasement, or financial repression. Savings disappear, pensions quietly fail, retirement becomes unattainable, and while the system and currency survive, the middle class does not. This sequence has occurred every time in history. Different names, different technologies, different excuses, but the same outcome. What makes this moment dangerous is not that something new is happening, but that we are late in the cycle and most people believe they are early. 127 million Americans believe their savings are safe, their pensions secure, their wages will catch up, and the system will self-correct. That belief has always existed right before the losses occur. The goal of this series is not to scare you, but to show the pattern so clearly that fear becomes unnecessary. Once you see the pattern, you stop reacting emotionally and start positioning logically, because the only variable that ever changes in history is who sees it early. To understand what happens next, we must look backward. Not at headlines, opinions, or forecasts, but at outcomes. History does not repeat itself in exact detail. It never has. But it always repeats in structure. When systems fail, they fail the same way, for the same reasons, and with the same consequences. Names change, technology changes, human behavior does not. Consider Rome. For centuries, Rome operated on what was considered a stable and reliable monetary system. The denarius held its value, trade expanded across the empire, and people could plan for the future. Wages bought necessities, savings retained value, and a middle class emerged that depended on currency, not land or power. This was the foundation of Roman stability. But over time, expansion began to outpace productivity. Wars grew longer and more expensive. Bureaucracy expanded. Political promises multiplied. The state required more resources than the economy could naturally produce. Rome did not collapse overnight. There was no single dramatic moment. Instead, the solution was gradual. The silver content of the denarius was slowly reduced. At first, it was almost unnoticeable. Then, it happened again and again. Eventually, the debasement became aggressive. The coin looked the same, but it bought less. Prices rose, wages failed to keep up, and savings quietly lost value year after year. The wealthy adapted because they owned land and real assets. The poor survived on subsistence. But the middle class, paid in currency and dependent on purchasing power, was destroyed. Rome continued for centuries after this process began. The empire survived. The currency survived. The Roman middle class did not. The same structure appeared again in Britain. In the early 20th century, the British pound was the world's reserve currency. Britain financed massive wars through debt and then attempted to preserve global dominance through monetary credibility. The pound remained powerful, and the institutions remained intact. But the cost was paid internally. Wages were suppressed. Rationing became normal. Capital controls were imposed. Inflation persisted. Britain did not disappear, and neither did the pound. But middle-class living standards declined permanently and never fully recovered. The United States followed a similar path in the 1970s. The dollar remained dominant, and the system did not collapse. But inflation destroyed savings, wages lagged behind costs, and asset prices disconnected from income. Those who owned real assets survived and adapted. Those who depended on wages and savings lost decades of purchasing power. These were not collapses. They were wealth transfers, executed quietly over time. Now map this same pattern onto the present. Over the last 2 decades, U.S. debt has grown faster than GDP. Not temporarily, but structurally. Household debt expanded, government debt exploded, corporate leverage increased. This is not an opinion, it is arithmetic. At the same time, wages failed to keep pace with housing, healthcare, education, and energy. Data from the last 12 to 24 months confirms exactly what the historical pattern predicts. Household savings rates are down, credit card balances and delinquencies are up, and housing affordability is near historic lows. These are not causes, they are symptoms. The system is no longer driven by productivity growth. It is driven by debt expansion. That places us firmly in stage 3, distortion. At this stage, the system must choose between allowing defaults and visible collapse, or suppressing pain through inflation and financial repression. Every modern system chooses repression. Defaults are visible, inflation is confusing, and inflation always hurts the middle class the most. The wealthy hedge, the poor receive assistance, the middle class pays through silent erosion. This is where the 127 million come in. They hold retirement accounts denominated in currency, savings that earn less than inflation, and wages tied to systems that always lag. They are not reckless. They did everything right. And that is precisely why they are exposed. The destruction of the middle class never looks like destruction. It looks like disappointment. Retirement is delayed. Savings do not stretch far enough. Children cannot afford homes. Healthcare consumes income. People blame themselves. They should not. This is structural. When currencies are diluted, savings lose value. When debt expands faster than productivity, wages fall behind. When assets inflate, ownership concentrates. The losses happen quietly through adjusted pensions, means-tested benefits, indirect taxes, and gradual erosion. Until one day, people realize the math no longer works. People remain employed and productive, but they fall behind year after year. They continue to work, to save, and to plan, yet the results no longer match the effort. This is how 127 million Americans lose everything without a single dramatic moment. There is no crash, no panic, and no clear turning point. Instead, the loss happens quietly, through smaller retirements, shrinking savings, rising costs, and opportunities that slowly disappear. Life goes on, but it becomes tighter, narrower, and more uncertain. As this happens, certain myths persist because they are comforting. The first is the belief that this time is different. It never is. Every cycle in history believed it had found a way to escape the old rules. Technology increases efficiency and speed, but it has never eliminated debt cycles, currency dilution, or the erosion of purchasing power. Innovation changes how systems operate, but it does not change how they end. The second myth is that the government will fix it. Governments do not protect savers. They protect systems. They always have. When forced to choose, governments preserve institutions, currencies, and stability, even if that stability comes at the expense of household purchasing power. Inflation, taxation, and financial repression are not accidents. They are tools used to manage systems that can no longer support their promises. The third myth is that growth will save us. Growth financed by debt is not growth. It is postponement. Borrowed growth creates the appearance of progress while pulling future purchasing power into the present. Eventually, the bill comes due. When it does, wages lag, savings shrink, and the middle class absorbs the cost. This has happened in every late-stage cycle, without exception. What survives in every cycle is always the same. Real assets, productive skills, flexibility, low dependence on fixed promises made by overstretched systems. This is not advice. It is observation. Those who understand the pattern early do not panic because panic is unnecessary. They reposition mentally. They stop trusting nominal numbers and begin paying attention to real value and real purchasing power. The system will continue. The currency will continue. Daily life will continue. But the middle class, as it has existed for decades, will not. That is not a threat. It is a historical outcome. Preparation is the only variable that has ever mattered. Once you understand the pattern, surprise disappears. And when surprise disappears, fear follows it. This series is not about telling you what to do. It is about making sure you are not the last to understand what is happening. Because history is patient. and it always collects its debts. If you want to continue this series, the next part examines how wealth quietly transfers upward during late-stage cycles, and why most people never notice it until the process is already complete. Subscribe if you want to see the pattern clearly, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it.